IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarthak and I welcome you to one more episode of All Things Policy. In India, the majority of households are engaged in agricultural activities. But the returns from agriculture in India tends to be low. Many farmers end up with unsustainable levels of debt. Some lead precarious lives. Some have even been driven to committing suicides. To address the challenges faced by those engaged in agriculture, the union government, different state governments have come up with different policies to support them. One such scheme is the Odisha government's Kalia scheme. Kalia stands for Krushak Assistance for Livelihood and Income Augmentation. In this episode, we are going to discuss the policy design of Kalia and what lessons does it hold for other states. To discuss this, I have with me a special guest, Ms. Shilpa Kumar. Shilpa is a partner with Omidyar Network. Her team has been documenting the journey of the Kalia scheme. At Omidyar, Shilpa provides leadership across the areas of digital ID, governance, citizen engagement, and property rights initiatives. She leads policy work in financial inclusion. Hi Shilpa, welcome to All Things Policy.
Hi Sarthak, pleasure to be here.
Same here. So Shilpa, can you just tell us about why you have been trying to document Kalia scheme and why are you interested in the farmer welfare schemes?
So, Sarthak, at Omidyar, we are deeply interested in the question of property rights and how property itself can really enable a much more productive and sustainable life for the millions of households which spend their time in the agri sector or which depend on the agri sector for their livelihoods. It's a important fact that almost 70% of India's 90 million agricultural households actually spend more than they earn on average each month. And this, pushes them towards debt and probably is the primary reason for more than half of the suicides by farmers nationwide. So I think the whole, aspect of how can agricultural household balance sheet, especially for the most vulnerable, how can they be strengthened? And, property rights, direct benefit schemes are an important component of all of this.
Yeah, so thanks for giving us a background to this. And so in the last few years, what we have been observing is different state governments and the union government as well, they have come out and they have implemented, they have initiated different policies, programs for farmers. And all these policies, programs, either they are waiving of loans or it can be related to direct income transfers. So why do you think it is important to study the direct income transfer scheme Kalia? Or rather, in other words, what is the objective of the Kalia scheme and what are the intended outcomes of the Kalia scheme?
So let me take that in two parts, Sarthak. I think the first important part is, naturally, it's the balance sheet, of the farmer which needs repair. The fact that, they're spending more than they earn. And debt is therefore an important part of what they do. Now, lots of governments in the past have actually tried the loan waiver route. And, I think there's a lot of research to show that that's not the best way to maybe address the problem of farmer balance sheets. And I think that's something the Odisha government really spent time looking at. The fact that, if you go down the loan waiver route, there are two things that happen. First of all, you only access farmers who have the ability to get formal credit, which is not all of them. The second is that the farmers who are actually repaying on time and therefore have, good credit records get disadvantaged because they don't get the benefit of loan waiver. And the third is really the whole systemic issue. The fact that, because loan waivers were such an important part of the agrarian ecosystem, it actually, I would argue, hampered the credit culture and in a sense reduced institutional lending to this sector even though, Sarthak, this is priority sector lending for banks.
Yeah.
So if you kind of look at the whole package, really getting more farmers into formal credit should be the objective, not distorting the credit culture.
Yeah, this is interesting given that a lot of our farmers they do not have access to formal financial channels, and somewhere I was reading that most of the farmers, majority of the farmers, they just have access to informal finances. So if you are providing something like a farm loan waiver, these farmers or those whoever are engaged in the agriculture sector, they are not going to get benefited.
Correct. That's true. And therefore, moving to the second part of your question, Sarthak, which is why did this, Kalia scheme interest us, and why did we think it was worth documenting? I think there were three or four, very important reasons. The first is, the scheme really tried to leverage, in a sense, the Jandhan Aadhaar mobile, trinity to come out with a cash transfer. It's fairly obvious that cash transfers are much better because they go more directly with less leakage. So that's the first thing. But I think the other and more important part of it is that the scheme was actually focused on really better targeting. And what struck us is, first of all, the fact that it included landless and tenant farmers. The second was it really, delinked assistance from the area of land owned. So it's not like if you had more land, you got more transfer.
Greater assistance.
Yes. The third is really, it was provided per farm family. And again, what's really interesting here is that the money actually was to be transferred to the account of the female member of the household. I thought that was really important from, increasing agency of women in farm households. And the last thing I thought, which, merited study, was how technology and administrative levers were used in conjunction to enable, better targeting of the population.
Yeah, this is, something which is interesting here. The point that you mentioned that tenant farmers and those who are landless agricultural laborers, they are also getting benefited from this scheme. So this is something which is typically not the case with other farm support programs, right? And this is one of those areas which needs to be focused upon, given that for in many states in India, land leasing is not considered to be legal. In Odisha also, it's not legal. So tenant farmers are those who do not have ownership of land. They are basically cultivating on someone's own land, and then there is no such contractual obligation. So these are the people who find it difficult to get formal finances, and they're extremely vulnerable. And again, landless agricultural households, right? So they don't own land and they're just working as laborers. And given that agriculture sector has, it does not have stable incomes throughout. During the peak season, maybe they will have some incomes. During the off-peak season, they will not have any income. So they are the ones I would think they are extremely vulnerable. And this scheme is trying to target them.
True, that's true. And you raise an important point, Sarthak, because so many state governments and indeed the government of India have tried various schemes to, kind of reach out to farmers. So, for example, you have the PM Kisan, which really targets 140 million farmers in the country and has a fairly large allocation. You have Jharkhand, which has tried something, Andhra Pradesh, which has tried something. You have Telangana's Raitu Bandhu scheme. And a lot of, these schemes are actually tied to transfers linked to record of property. And just like you mentioned, given, sometimes the problems that small and marginal farmers have in proving title, as well as, the tenant farmers, a lot of them actually don't get reached, even though they are, honestly speaking, the most vulnerable and probably least able to access formal credit. And therefore, what's interesting here, Sarthak, is that it's an alternate approach, which is, in a sense, a little bit different from trying to maybe work on property records.
Yeah.
Instead, it just tries to go directly to trying and identifying who the beneficiaries should be.
Yeah. So, and here also there are many interesting things when it comes to identification of beneficiaries. So, Shilpa, when you are talking about beneficiaries, right? So, this is something which is very, very important for the successful implementation of any direct income transfer schemes, because at the end of the day, you are transferring money into the account of these beneficiaries. So, we have to correctly identify the beneficiaries. And if you look at the scheme, it is targeting the agricultural sector, and within the agriculture sector, there is bound to be a huge number of beneficiaries. So one thing that I came across was, so in your document, when you're documenting the scheme, that initially some 1.2 crore applications were there for to be eligible for this scheme. So shortlisting who is going to be the beneficiaries would have been difficult. And something that we see in the agricultural sector, not everyone is a farmer, right? There might be some who are farmers, but then there are others who are not farmers. They do not own any land. They might be cultivating in someone else's land. These are tenant farmers. And then there are some who are just agricultural laborers. And within farmers also, you have different types of farmers. Some have huge lands. Maybe they're owning more than 20 hectares of land. Some own hardly 0.5 hectares of land. So identifying beneficiaries would have been something which is difficult. So from your own experience of documenting this scheme, what have you found? How has the Odisha government gone ahead? What was the rationale that they have used in shortlisting these beneficiaries? How they have decided who should qualify and who should not for this particular scheme? Is it on the basis of landholding size? Is it on the basis of operational tenure?
Sarthak, I think that was, one of the most interesting things about this scheme, because it was, dealing with scale, really a large size of population. That's one. The other is, identification really required not just use of data and technology, but also in the end, bringing in a lot of administrative processes to streamline the data. And that's why we actually, felt documenting this might, throw up some very interesting insights. I think what we picked up from this exercise is, first of all, what they have called unification, verification, and exclusion framework, which the government of Odisha used. The first thing they did was really they looked at all the comprehensive databases that they already had. Say for example, something like the seeds benefit transfer database or the paddy procurement database. So that was, in a sense, starting with data. To that, they actually added, offline process, which was what they called green forms, which farmers who wanted to apply could fill in and enroll in the scheme. And once they kind of, aggregated the two databases and the green forms, they actually had a unified database of about 1.2 crore applications, which was a large number.
Yeah.
So once they had that, naturally they then had to kind of dedupe that data, with Aadhaar numbers, names, make sure, there was a match over there. So that was like the second step, the deduping. The third step, and this is also very interesting, Sarthak, because it was really how do you use on-ground verification to check for, the accuracy of the data that you collected. It really meant involving field officials and actually having them interface with farmer households. That was the second important part of the UV framework. The last part, and that was also very important, is really exclusion.
Yes.
Very interestingly, there are three modes of exclusion. One is an individual could actually fill in a red form and voluntarily declare themselves to be ineligible. And it's interesting, Sarthak, that they actually received 5 lakh red forms. So that was, the first form of exclusion. The second was involving, like I said, field officials to go and check for eligibility against criteria. So that's the second. And the third was really to again use different databases to check, for example, if an applicant who had come in was possibly a government employee, a teacher, maybe employed with the police. So in a sense, making sure that there was no alternate source of income. That was the third form of exclusion. And the combination of these three things actually helped them to come up with a final list to whom they could give direct benefit transfers.
Yeah. So basically, one is they're using the database, right? So basically, the government already has some database that is being used, but at the same time, those who are engaged in the agriculture sector, they themselves can fill a form. So it's not a top-down approach, neither it is a bottom-up approach, right? So they are combining both these things together.
That's true. That's true.
So there are some schemes in which generally you have self-identification, right? So for example, National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, self-identification of beneficiary is there. While in some cases it is just a top-down approach, but here they are using a hybrid approach that we can say, right?
That's true. And, the point I want to make about this, Sarthak, and, we've seen this not just, in rural programs, but even in the urban situation, that you might have the best of technology, but until you have a last mile, physical connect that works well, all of that technology and data can be of no use. And therefore, really, I find that, the ability to engage and energize the last mile connection becomes critical.
Yeah, so this is something which is interesting because nowadays everywhere we just in the political discourse everywhere it is like this, right? That we need to change everything online. We need to have wherever it is possible use technology. But here there is an interesting point that technology is important, but at the same time you need to have field officials as well.
Correct. That's right.
Yeah. So so since we're talking about technology and data, so one question I had. So in this case, right? So you got somewhere around the Odisha government got somewhere around 1.2 crore initial applications, and they are dealing with multiple databases, right? Some of the databases are from the state government. Some of the databases have been collected by the union government. So the state is working with so many different databases. It is capturing so much amount of information. How does the scheme ensure adequate data privacy?
Right. I think that's, really a very critical point, Sarthak. And, the belief we always have at Omidyar is, on the one hand, tech can really be a force for good. It can really drive change, enable reach, reduce costs. But at the same time, as you aggregate more and more data, the need to be, responsible about the data that you have becomes paramount. And I think it's really important to, think about the design principles of any GovTech scheme. So on the one hand, if you look at it from, like, how can you enable GovTech platforms? You naturally think about them as, how do you make it more interoperable, modular? How do you have open source technology, open APIs? How do you literally get platforms to talk to each other and enable rapid and cost-effective leveraging? But on the flip side, when you think about, the responsibility that, tech should have, then you really need to weave in privacy by design principles into GovTech platforms right from the beginning. So on the one hand, it's about security. So security in the sense of, is there a secure firewall? Is access to farmer data only available on a need to know basis? So that's like one part of it. The other part of it is really to do with how do you, ensure that, appropriate privacy standards are maintained? How do you ensure that consent is taken for use for different purposes? And I think both things need to be, looked at, and not just the use of technology, to, in a sense, enlarge the activities of the government, but also how do you be more responsible in the use of technology?
So Shilpa, one more question here. Related, in case of any scheme, this is one of the challenges that we face. One is the budgetary allocation, and again, what is the budgetary allocation required for implementation? So in case of Kalia scheme, how much budgetary allocation was required for the implementation of Kalia?
That's a great question, Sarthak, because when I looked at the numbers, look, Kalia itself had an annual budget allocation of about 2,000 odd crores in December of 2018. But if you look at the fact that how much did it cost them to implement, it was about 2% of the Kalia budget. More importantly, it actually involved a very substantial part of the government machinery, almost 50,000 government officials at the state, district, and block level. So the point I think which is very interesting over here is that the ability to reach out to almost 55 lakh beneficiaries, to do this in a direct income transfer way with minimal leakage, actually the cost of implementation was just 2% of the Kalia budget. And I think that's a really important point, Sarthak.
Yeah, so the cost for implementation is not much, and the major chunk of the budgetary allocation towards Kalia is going to the eligible beneficiaries.
That's correct. And therefore, it really stresses the point that if you have good design and focused execution, the cost of implementation is not that high.
Yeah, so this is something which is interesting because typically in many of the welfare schemes that we have, the transaction costs tend to be quite high, as a result of which whatever the beneficiaries are getting at the end is quite low. Right, so this is something that possibly the Odisha government has taken care of. Now, one more thing related to the benefits here. Benefits in the sense, what is the benefits all these eligible beneficiaries are getting? Now, does the scheme have any mechanism for reviewing and monitoring the performance? Right? Let's say the scheme has been implemented now. It's going on still. The implementation is going on. So, do they have any periodic review monitoring mechanism? And what all they are trying to monitor?
So it's interesting you ask this because, our assessment of what happened is that part of the reason maybe for, effective implementation was the constant, review and monitoring mechanisms at each of the district, block and panchayat level. So, the fact that each layer of the state machinery was involved and in a sense, kind of reassessing progress on a very regular basis. And from what we understand in the document, appears to have had a very direct participation of the entire administrative leadership, including that of the agriculture department. What's also interesting, Sarthak, and this really stood out for me, is the online grievance redressal mechanism that they had even during implementation. Because giving direct cash transfers on the ground is a complex business. And they're bound to be, lots of complaints, clarifications, questions. And how do you manage this? Because in my mind, if you can handle grievance redressal, you can really build trust for citizens. The thing that struck me is how, there was a kind of constant feedback loop to check out what was going wrong and then to build that back into the implementation system. And I want to just share two, illustrations which stood out for me.
Sure.
So one is, anyone who wants to be, for example, included has to have a certain set of documents which they need to give. First of all, there was this checklist of, documents. If you want to say file for a grievance, and then, if you were to upload this and something was missing, you would actually, get a message back saying the document was missing. Now, it might sound very elementary, but to have a feedback loop, which, even integrates with, let's say, an SMS message to the applicant, becomes extremely important. Otherwise, lots of times for citizens, it's about, you fill in a form and you don't know what went wrong. And therefore, these small design changes and the feedback loop in the grievance redressal mechanism, I think really stood out for me because it's, an important part of any successful implementation.
That's interesting. I mean, the way policies are designed makes a lot of impact. Now, one question I had related to the grievance redressal mechanism. So, was it only online, or is there some way by which offline also people can go ahead with their grievances?
So, the interesting thing is that they did have, village level, field workers who are actually helping farmers to submit their grievances. And this again takes me back to the point, Sarthak, that in this digital world, especially for vulnerable communities, it's, the phygital layer that becomes so important. That how do you make the digital come to life for a person who's not very familiar with digital means. And I think this speaks to that as well.
Yeah. So till now, we have been talking about all those things which have possibly benefited those who are involved in the agriculture sector. Now, any public policy that we have, they generally tend to have some form of unintended consequences. So, with the Kalia scheme, what do you think can be some unintended consequences? Is there any way it could be mitigated?
Yeah, so, one thing, and especially because we started this conversation, talking about property rights. So one, thought in my mind is this approach actually is an alternate approach to property rights. But on the other hand, really getting property records sorted out themselves might be an important agenda and improving the quality of property records. The other thing I'd say is, and you mentioned it, Sarthak, is this whole the fact that tenancies are not recognized and the implications they have for small and marginal farmers who are really tenant farmers. I think that's another, very big implication. So I'd say those two are important things to watch out for and to think about how they can be brought into better solutions.
Okay. And one more observation that I had is the state government is involved, the state officials are involved at multiple levels, right? So the success of the scheme is also dependent to some extent on the capacity of the state to provide for different kind of services here, right? From the beginning itself, state is involved in identifying beneficiaries. So they're doing that. And again, when it comes to grievance redressal, they're involved at different stages. So for the scheme to be successful, I mean, we need to have the right kind of state capacity. And in case of India, different states might have different state capacity. So is the scheme slightly dependent on the governments?
Yeah, so I think, implementation will always, be dependent on state capacity. So on the one hand, of course, the political will to put that as an agenda in terms of whatever is the intended outcome. But then to execute it really depends, like we saw, Sarthak, on many different levels of state government capacity. On the one hand, it's the leadership, the chief secretary, the principal secretary, agriculture, for instance, in this case. At another level, it's actually about, the block level officials. And at the third level, it's about panchayat levels. I think what, this assessment left me with is when there is strong will and strong leadership, drive, maybe actually you can deliver effectively on the ground. So I think it becomes a question of both things. And then, of course, the ability to use other mechanisms. So, for example, in this case, it was almost something like chat groups, for example, which was also embedded in the part of how review and monitoring was happening. So it's really a mixture of everything, right? I mean, it is important to have good state capacity, but I would argue that, it's a gradual process. And even today, it's possible to actually achieve good outcomes when there is will and good leadership for implementation.
Yeah. And right now, I mean, many other states are also thinking about having these direct income transfer schemes for those who are engaged in agriculture. So if you have to put all these things together, or rather, in other words, we can say that if you think that there are certain enablers that helped in successful implementation of Kalia, what would that be? So what are those lessons for other states from the Kalia scheme?
So I think, what stood out for us in this, Sarthak, is a couple of things. First of all, in terms of objectives. And I do think, it's worth re-mentioning the fact that, it actually addressed not just farmers with valid property records, but also tenant farmers. I think that was one important thing. The second is, the gender inclusion by trying to direct money to the female member of the household. I think that was also, very important. The other thing that really, stood out for me was in terms of implementation, how a good review and monitoring mechanism, which really builds in a feedback loop, how that can be helpful. And most important is really not just technology, but technology plus administrative levers plus last mile connect on the ground, how all three are really important to really deliver. And lastly, I'll say if there's, kind of design principles at work, it doesn't cost that much to actually deliver direct income transfers to such a large population.
So policy design is something which is very, very important.
Yes, policy and process, both, I would
say. Yeah. So one last thing, in case you want to improve on this, is there any scope for further improvement on the present design? Maybe this is something that the states which are going to implement similar kind of schemes in future, they can consider.
No, so I would actually start to flip back to the two other things that I mentioned, and maybe out of those two, just focus on one. That I think in the end, it's important to have a focus on property rights themselves and to actually strengthen mechanisms for better recording, better transfer, and better sale processes for property rights. I think there's no getting away from that, because that will truly, be enabling and empowering at source.
So Shilpa, one more thing that comes to my mind is after few years, right? The scheme has been implemented. So after few years, should there be some form of evaluation? And this evaluation should basically be of what kind of transition has happened in agriculture, what kind of transformation has happened, have the farm incomes changed, have those who are in agriculture, they are more productive, or now there are some people who have moved out of agriculture, because one problem that we have in agriculture is there are too many people in agriculture. We have not made a transition to manufacturing and other sectors. So if the number of people in agriculture reduce, if people are transitioning away from agriculture, then it might be considered as a success. So should we be evaluating these things?
Yeah, great question, Sarthak, because there's so many different things that are being tried at this point in time. I think it's really important to have, independent assessment and evaluation of a lot of these things to figure out what's going right and then to double down on that. So I think impact assessment is really important. And, I would argue that why just for this scheme, it should be, in a sense, be done for a lot of the different things that are being tried, just so that it helps us to better direct our resources and our energies. And that's something, frankly, which we at Omidyar, believe quite a lot in.
Yeah. So this is also something that not only with Kalia scheme, with other schemes also should be there.
That's true.
So Shilpa, thanks for helping us understand the Kalia scheme. Thanks for telling us about some of the interesting facets of the scheme and how the scheme can be used by, or the lessons from the scheme can be used by other states. So Shilpa, thanks for joining us in this episode of All Things Policy.
Thank you, Sarthak.
And thanks to the audience for staying with us, for tuning in. We'll meet again in one more episode of All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Cred and Sia. Thank you so much for making this possible. We've had an amazing week on the network. Do check out The Note with Mahrukh Inayat. She speaks to Prabhat Kumar, the man leading child protection at one of India's leading NGOs, Save the Children. On The Habit Coach, Ashton was joined by Rajat Mittal Shah to talk about some superfoods in Ayurveda like turmeric and ashwagandha. On Paisa Vaisa, host Anupam Gupta has a digital gold special in 2 parts, one with Ashraf Rizvi, founder and CEO of Digital Swiss Gold, and Gilded, and one with Deepak Abbott, co-founder of India Gold. Listen to the first part of the Father's Day special of Agla Station Adulthood with Natasha and her father, Dr. Vipul Roy Rathod. You should also check out Cyrus Says' episode with Mukul Chadda. He talks about upcoming shows Sunflower and Sherni. Our Kannada podcast, Thale Artist, celebrates 100 episodes, and we had a reunion of hosts Pawan, Ganesh, and Surya who shared their favorite moments from the past. Shiva Mehta is back with the second season of Smile India. The show is available in both English and Hindi. On this episode, she talks about the conversion from bag teas to bagless ones and how we should ditch the plastic and have a great tea experience. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Working Monday to Friday glued to your chair making you feel dull? Worry not. Get your 5-minute weekly dose of travel around the world with Postcards from Nowhere. Join me every Thursday as I explore the strange, obscure, and fascinating parts of the world and bring out facets of travel you may not have thought of before. You can find us on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you get your podcast from.